The US is leaving European security to the Europeans. And one of the major problems this leaves Europe is industrial. Right now, Europe's defense industry is struggling to live up to the moment. However, in the long run, a perfect storm might be brewing. Is this the start of a European military-industrial complex which might one day match the American one? Or is it just another blip in the unsatisfying history of European defense integration? Let's find out. With the Trump administration, it is always very difficult to separate tough deal-making strategy from long-term policy.
Did I say that? I can't believe I said that.
In order to find out what the US really wants, let's take a look at two other indicators of what the US might do in the future. The first being American public opinion, which is something Trump does care about. A recent poll shows that 58% of Americans no longer believe it is in the US's interest to assist Ukraine. Now, that same poll also shows that over half of Republicans no longer believe it serves US national security to be a member of NATO. And these numbers are evolving quickly in favor of a more isolationist US approach. Someone like J.D. Vance, for example, has always been propagating these views, and it looks like he is really tightening his grasp over US foreign policy. When we zoom out a little bit, this new US approach actually seems a lot like the pivot to Asia, but on steroids. Because not only is it going super fast, the US is now also actively trying to peel Russia away from China. This pivot to Asia had already started under the Obama administration, leading us to believe that even if the next president does turn out to be a Democrat, the US and Europe are highly unlikely to get back together. So for Europe, even if this US withdrawal from NATO is far from a certainty, there are actually quite a few signs that it might do so in the future, and this leaves European nations no choice but to prepare for the worst case scenario. The problem with Europeans taking care of their own defense and the defense of Ukraine is not a financial one. The total US aid, both militarily and financially, to Ukraine over the course of 3 years comes down to about 250 euros per European. For reference, this is about 1% of the average European yearly wage. This is not an impossible problem to solve. Now, where Europe does get into trouble is with its defense industry. All European defense companies combined can by far not produce enough weapons and ammunition to keep up with what Ukraine needs on the battlefield. And it gets even more embarrassing for Europe's defense industry. Ukraine on its own now produces more weapons and ammunition than all other European countries combined. For Ukraine, this is of course a matter of survival, but still these production numbers are impressive. We're talking about a country with a pre-war economy about 1/3 the size of that of Belgium, that is now producing over 2.5 million artillery shells every year. And they're doing this whilst their facilities are getting bombarded by Russian missiles every day. This shows us three things. First of all, the output of Europe's defense industry when it comes to conventional warfare simply sucks. 2. Europe's defense industry can actually learn a lot from Ukraine when it comes down to ramping up capacity, but not just this, also in terms of innovation, because Ukraine, forced by the realities of war, has actually become a hub for massively successful military startups. Think of Ukraine's Delta system, for example. This software has had international praise, also from the Americans, for being one of the most capable systems of coordinating a multitude of different weapon sets on the battlefield. 3. Ukraine offers a big opportunity in terms of purchasing power parity. Suffice it to say, €1 buys a lot more in Ukraine than it does in the US. So even after the war, if Ukraine keeps up some of that production capacity, European armies would be massively benefiting by buying from them instead of buying from the US. And that's just from the industrial side of things. Let's not forget that Ukraine also has over 900,000 active military personnel, which is more than half of the rest of Europe combined. Now, Europe's defense industry, why is it lagging behind? Is it simply a question of European nations not spending enough, or is there something else going on? It's not as if nothing has happened since the beginning of the war. European nations in 2024 collectively managed to spend 2% of their GDP. Therefore, they met NATO's target, albeit collectively. 2% might not seem like much, but let's compare this to 2018. Back then, Europe spent only 1.35% of its GDP towards defense. Now, this is a relative increase of 60%. Yet, even with this 60% increase, most experts agree that Europe hasn't become more autonomous from the US. Now, why is this? Of course, the 60% increase was mostly aimed at providing help for Ukraine instead of making Europe more independent from the US. In real numbers, European nations together spend about 3 times as much on their defense as the Russians do. So, if we are vastly outspending our primary threat, how come we are still so incapable of acting without the Americans? The answer lies in purchasing power parity. This basically means the Russians get more bang for their buck. So much so that even though we're outspending them 3-1, they're actually outperforming us in terms of the capacities they are building. In the public debate, purchasing power parity is often explained just by low labor costs, but it's so much more. When Russia produces its ammunition and weapon systems, it exerts full control over the entire production cycle, from raw material extraction to final assembly. This level of self-sufficiency not only reduces reliance on foreign suppliers, it also massively reduces costs. Therefore, the Russians are able to stretch their budget 3 times as far as Europe. Okay, now let's talk about what actually happens with Europe's defense budget. When a European country can't find a supplier domestically, it uses only 22% of its budget to buy with their European neighbors. 63% of that budget, on the other hand, goes straight across the Atlantic, amounting to a total US export of about $110 billion. When you're spending money on a defense system, that should generally have 2 defensive purposes. The first is by the actual defense that system provides itself, and the second is by investing in a long-term production capability. Because these defensive systems, whether it's tanks or fighter jets or ammunition, they are meant for war, which means there's a large chance that at some point they will get destroyed and they will have to be replaced. For the past 30 years, most European countries have been actively ignoring that second purpose. They've done this by either not investing at all or by buying off-the-shelf American systems. Now, for Europe's defense industry, this has 3 detrimental consequences. Number 1, this makes defense investment a lot less attractive. If you're not investing in your own industry, you're not creating jobs, and you're not advancing yourself technologically. 2, it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where European companies never get large orders and they therefore never get to the scale of their American counterparts. Therefore, they can never achieve the prices which their American counterparts can, which results in other European countries also buying American. 3, the US does not have unlimited production capacity. Many of Europe's American orders are already getting massive delays because of the war in Ukraine, of course, but also because of a lack of skilled US labor. And this problem is only getting worse. The limitations of the US defense industry undercut the view that a European reliance on the US defense industry is a way to pay back for the American security umbrella, because that reasoning relies on the existence of a US defense industry surplus, and the moment a bigger conflict breaks out, let's say in Taiwan, that surplus completely ceases to exist. And with that, the European nations not only don't get the systems they need, but they also lose the little leverage they have over the US. The only European country that always refused to rely on the US defense industry is France. And this has paid off economically, because France is now the world's 2nd largest defense exporter. One country who's paying attention to France's lucrative defense exports is Germany. After the American interference in the German federal elections, German trust in the US is at an all-time low. Germany's next Bundeskanzler, Friedrich Merz, is about to take over, and he didn't take kindly on the US trying to promote his adversary. The US trade war with Europe is actually hitting German car manufacturers the hardest, and the German population has already had a sample of the potential success of its defense industry with the explosive growth of Rheinmetall. With its industry in dire need of revitalization, the European defense challenge might just be exactly what Germany needs. And Merz is not wasting any time. By convincing the German parliament to step away from its famous Schwarze Null policy, he now has the budgetary space to pursue his €1 trillion investment plan. That is 1 trillion with a tr. Germany and France together provide about 70% of the net contributions toward the European Union. However, they are not alone, and these other European Union countries, often smaller, do fear that they will get left out when it comes to the consolidation of Europe's defense industry, because their smaller defense companies might not be able to compete with the large French and German giants. These reservations are correct. However, the size of Europe's total defense industry is about to blow up, and there is a lot more to be won by investing wisely in the right startups or the right adaptations of the current industry than there is to be lost by not protecting those parts of your industry which are not competitive. And we haven't even talked about the European Union yet. The Commission has recently proposed the Rearm Europe plan, which consists of 650 billion euros in fiscal leniency towards the member states and 150 billion euros in loans which will be granted to European defense projects. The plan has been rebranded since, but the new name really sucks, so let's just keep calling it Rearm Europe. For a project to qualify for these loans, 65% of it will have to be made in Europe. That in and of itself is quite revolutionary. However, this plan does not entail a common procurement budget, because fiscal leniency doesn't even require a budget and those loans will have to be paid back. But the European Union really needs that budget though. Let's take a look at the painstakingly slow development of the Eurodrone, for example. This shows that when European nations go at it on a purely collaborative basis, they get bogged down into everlasting discussions on which exact capabilities this system needs, but more importantly, where these systems will get produced. Therefore, you really need that common procurement budget to push these things forward. The Union already has a tool for common procurement, being the European Defence Fund. However, right now, this fund is so small it cannot really impact any large-scale projects. But things are moving fast right now, and it wouldn't be a massive surprise if the European Commission announces a plan for an upgrade of the European Defence Fund in the near future. Now, let's get back to the transatlantic relation. The US's lucrative defense exports to Europe have been the reason why the US has historically always opposed European defense integration, as well as a Europe-first mindset when it comes to defense procurement. The Trump administration seems a lot less worried about this, and one refreshing theory on why this might be comes from CSIS's Max Bergman. He believes that when the US pulls back from NATO, it still needs a strong and reliable European partner when it comes to counterbalancing China. And therefore the US needs to give up on some of its defense industrial interests. But considering the current rift between the US and Europe, it might actually be kind of an optimistic view to still consider us natural allies. Although, perhaps, if the emotions of the day die down, a lot might still be possible. A more negative view on the transatlantic relation is that just as the US is trying to peel Russia away from China, China might be heavily interested in peeling Europe away from the US. Let me know what you think in the comments. Will Europe finally live up to the moment, or will this just be another blip in the unsatisfying history of European defense integration? Also, this was my first video, so don't hesitate to give me feedback or ideas for future videos. Bye.